And welcome in, everybody. This is Michael Rathburn with rotocurve.com here with a special State of DFS show tonight. And I got a special guest for me, Ricky Sanders from Fantasy Draft. I want to welcome him into the State of DFS show. How you doing tonight, Rick?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to catch up with you. Obviously, a lot of exciting things going on over at Fantasy Draft, so we'll get into that. But why don't you've been in the fantasy sports business for quite a while. Your name is quite recognizable in the industry. Why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself? Like, how did you get started? What sites have you been on? And then kind of how did you land at Fantasy Draft?
Yeah, so it's kind of a unique situation how I got started. I was actually working for the family business, and I was not enjoying it. I was delivering tortillas for a living, and Saturday mornings I would always tune in. I mean, every morning I would, but Saturday morning specifically, I would tune into SiriusXM Fantasy on my phone, and it just got to the point where I love fantasy sports forever and ever and ever, and I was listening to certain people on the channel. I'm like, I would love to do this. I think I could do it to an adequate level at the very least. So I kind of started writing my own fantasy sports blog with a friend, and it just so happened that the next week, Mark Healy of Going Nine Baseball was on the air. I was listening to him, and he said, "Any writers, any prospective writers have an interest, please send me a resume." So I jumped on it immediately. I mean, no sooner did he say that, I pulled over to the side of the road and literally sent him an email quickly. And I guess he looked at it, and I ended up getting it. Me, Evan Terracciano, the
Oh,
Roto
wow.
Wizard. Yeah, Joe Pisapia. I think he
Oh,
started at
nice,
that same
nice.
time. So we all got on that show, and that's where I started. I still remember, the first show and how brutal it was. The first guy I was ever asked about. I'm just this guy who's going on air for the first time. Mark Healy asked me about Juan Francisco, who's the second string third baseman for the Milwaukee Brewers. So that it was quite the experience. But after about a year or so with them, I was doing radio. They decided not to re-up. So Evan went with Roto Experts, and I kind of went with a few side projects. Fantasy basketball money leagues, I think, was one of them. Fake pigskin I went with. That was a lot of fun. But, I talked to Evan, and Evan finally said, I think there's some openings there. And he hooked me up with the phone conversation with Scott Engel, talked to him, joined Roto Experts. That turned into Daily Roto with,
There you
Mike
go.
Leone, Drew Dinkmeyer. And from there, I started doing radio and writing for them. And I kind of made a connection with the guys at Fantasy Draft. And now here I am.
Well, I got to tell you, Rick, our paths are about as similar as they can possibly get. I started off, and I remember when you sent me an email, actually, you sent me a very long email that I could tell you were very serious about getting into the industry, which a lot of people don't realize the hard work that it takes and the fact that you're probably going to have to work for a while and not get paid, pay your dues. And I got some advice early on. It was there's 3 points of advice that somebody gave me way back when. They said, carve a niche for yourself. Like, become the number one guy in whatever it is that you're going to do. Just find something, and you're going to be the go-to guy for that particular piece of fantasy sports. So my initial was minor league baseball prospects, and then obviously I transitioned that into the daily. Number 2 was to be humble. Because the industry was small and it could spit you out really quick. And then number 3 was always say yes to an opportunity as long as you don't put it ahead of your family. So whenever somebody would call me to go on the radio or call me up or email me to write an article, whatever, I always said yes. The one time I did say no when I was actually looking at houses, and it was on a Sunday, and I wasn't going to interrupt that with my wife, and so I did remember saying no early on to something like that. As you get forward, you actually have to learn to start saying no once you get established. So that's kind of like the 4th thing I would put in there. But I actually started off with Roto Experts way back in around 2010, 2011. Similar situation as you. Scott Engel and I spoke. They threw me on the site. Within a couple months, they put me on air. And at the time, I was doing minor league baseball, dynasty football, and I kind of transitioned into the daily stuff when FanDuel and Draft Street had just come out, and Roto Experts was looking into the daily game way back when, around 2010, 2011. And that's when Daily Joust came calling, and I quit my job in Florida, moved to North Carolina, and actually got a gig with Daily Jow. So our paths have definitely been similar. And the lineage that you had with Going Nine is a great story. It's great to see all the guys that came out of that and where they are today. They're obviously, most of them have moved on to bigger and better things, which speaks to Mark's eye for talent. So good stuff on that. Now let's get into fantasy draft. That's obviously why we're here tonight. Let's talk about last year. Look, fantasy draft is a different model, so to speak. They do have that quote unquote multi-level marketing affiliate program, referral program, and they do have a lot of athletes behind the site endorsing the site. And there was a lot of fanfare with fantasy drafts launch last year, which I believe was more towards the end of the NFL season, probably around week 13, week 14, if I'm not mistaken. And so let's talk about, your involvement at the time of fantasy draft, right before they launched, and kind of walk me through some of that stuff that you guys were going through at that point.
So I was just involved at that point with a group that we had interviewed with them to be some of their top affiliates, recruiters for the site at that point. And, we were, along with everyone we were recruiting, and the site started up. And so at that point, I was not actually involved with the site. Since then, it's kind of evolved. I've since left the past group who I was working with at the time, which was kind of just a day job. It was kind of a mutual friend that ended up getting us involved with fantasy draft. He was a professional poker player. It turned out the director of the World Poker Tour was involved with the site. And so they were friends. And through that, we kind of got involved with the top guys. We flew out, we met them in person, and then we became recruiting. And, along the way, I stayed in touch with them. And when I decided, my time with the last guys was up, I called the guys at Fantasy Draft, and this few month time period, I hopped on board with them.
All right, cool. Let's talk about Fantasy Draft itself as a site. One of the things I've always said is I actually think it's the best looking site, for what that's worth. And I do think it's worth a lot, is for a brand new site that launched last year and is kind of stayed under the radar in terms of not making a major splash yet in terms of, in the top 5, top 7 sites, although I think that's going to happen this year. It's a very slick looking website. I mean, I can't say it enough. To me, I think it's the best interface in DFS. So with that being said, we know there's a lot of funding behind fantasy draft. Obviously, I'm not sure how much you want to get into it. I mean, I can talk about a little bit. I know the background of the gentleman that's that's a part of it, that's leading it from ACN. We've kind of I've crossed paths with that company in other ventures. So I know about ACM. I know about some of the other companies that are involved, Zoom Energy, etc. So there's a lot in play here. Last year, big splash in NFL at the end of the year. Some big GPPs, obviously a lot of people playing on the site. And then the site kind of took a hiatus. And so why don't you talk a little bit about, kind of what happened toward, after the NFL season had concluded, and, what fantasy draft was kind of looking at as far as, let's say, leading up to March and April, when, typically that's when you're going to launch MLB. Talk about why fantasy draft maybe hit the pause button a little bit and decided let's hold off and maybe come out in July.
Well, I think Fantasy Draft took a look at themselves, and they took a look at DraftKings and FanDuel, and they thought that in order to be competitive, additional features needed to be added. So they kind of took a pause to make sure that they could get everything right. My lineups feature, they added the export feature, they added all kinds of features that initially the website didn't have, and they felt that it was necessary during that time period to get it all right. That's really what the time was. They went from an old interface to a new interface because they felt that needed to be up to standards. And like you said, you see the way it is now. I think it looks great. I think it's kind of a mixture of FanDuel's colors and DraftKings interface, and it kind of takes the best of both worlds. And they needed, an extended period to switch programming teams and kind of get that all nailed down.
Okay. Just in my discussions, I do know a little bit about fantasy draft. And if you can't comment on this, that's fine. But my understanding is that the programmers were in Texas. Is that programming team now in North Carolina, so everything is under one roof?
The original guys were in Texas. Honestly, and I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know where the new programming group came
Okay.
from. I know they switched programming groups,
Okay. Well,
and I
switching
know they're very
switching
happy
programming
with it. Yeah,
groups is a huge undertaking. So just that in of itself, the fact that Fantasy Draft recognized that they needed to do that early on, and it was such a huge undertaking that to have to maybe go on a hiatus for a little bit to get it right makes sense, because really and truly you don't get a lot of chances, and you're burning a lot of money obviously as well.
right.
So it's good to kind of regardless of if it's still in Texas or it's in North Carolina, I can understand why you would want your programmers in house if they can get that talent here, because it just the peace of mind, and if something breaks, you can reach to somebody and you can say, hey, can you fix this, versus having to get on the phone, get on Skype, whatever, and then hope that person's around. So having things under one roof. So we'll look into that a little bit further. Let's talk about what's going on right now at Fantasy Draft. Let's talk about the Clayton Kershaw experience promo that's going on right now, which is phenomenal. The best pitcher in baseball, who's obviously a great guy. I've seen some interviews with him and some of the charity work that he does. Seems like an incredible. We call him a guy, but he's really a kid, because I'm 40 and he's like 26, or I don't know how old he is. So, but awesome. I mean, I would kill to meet Clayton Kershaw. So, why don't you talk about how that came about and what's going on with that?
Yeah, so we've kind of been kicking around the idea of live finals because, who doesn't love the live finals? I know, DraftKings have been very successful. FanDuel, Fantasy Aces has dove into it. So if, you're going to be serious in the industry, you got to do some live events, and they're just a lot of fun. And I think this one is really unique in the fact that, a lot of the qualifiers are top heavy. And this one, out of 1,100 possible participants, pieces are being paid along with the grand prize. And what the grand prize is all expenses paid trip to Los Angeles. And that's, you get airfare, you get hotel, you get a premium ticket, and then you get to spend time on field, autographs, schmoozing with Clayton Kershaw before the game. Then you get to obviously see the game and get sent back home. Plus, they give you some spending money even beyond that. So that's a first prize, and then there's still plenty of cash payments. And I feel like other sites haven't taken advantage of that. It's been just so top heavy that it hasn't made financial sense to join qualifiers. While this gives you a chance to win it and make some money.
Yeah, I agree. I've been a big proponent of that, whether it was on my previous DFS Minute videos or on SiriusXM or on RotoCurve, other stated DFS shows. I've been a very staunch proponent of fixing qualifiers. I think that, some of these are bankroll bleeders and bankroll killers. And I'm excited to see, Fantasy Aces. I love what they're doing. Where it's really advantageous to play in their qualifiers. Obviously, they tie into a live event as well. So it's great to see that you bring your insight as a player to Fantasy Draft and say, hey, we don't necessarily need to follow what FanDuel and DraftKings are doing in this particular area, and this is why. So I think that's obviously they've done a lot of great things, but I think as a smaller site, the last thing you want to do is run qualifiers where all your liquidity is wrapped up in qualifiers, and it sucks the money out of the ecosystem. Right. It's not healthy. So I think that's a great job by you and Fantasy Draft to realize that, hey, this is the best way for us to run a live experience qualifier. And also too is, and I talked about this on a stated DFS, is I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be a live final. We've seen DraftKings do the MLB stuff with that relationship with MLB, but I think meeting the player, and I think that's taken it to a whole nother level. We've seen guys like Bo Jackson, Jerry Rice, Dr. J get involved at some of these live events. I think getting Kershaw involved is pretty cool. Obviously, the relationship with MLB and DFS is great, to the point where Kershaw and the Dodgers feel comfortable enough to do that. So I think, I was like blown away when I saw the promo. I was like, yeah, that's what more sites need to be doing. So I like that it's attainable. I like that it's affordable, and there's more than one opportunity to win. And hopefully we'll see some other things coming in NFL. I know guys like Drew Brees are involved with Fantasy Draft, so who knows? Maybe that can be something that we see in the future. that's going to be about it. I think what we want to talk about as far as kind of wrapping it up on fantasy draft is, what's, if at all you can say anything, what's kind of the game plan for fantasy draft coming up in the NFL season? Obviously, you can paint broad strokes. I don't need specifics, but just kind of like what's kind of the top three things that fantasy draft wants to maybe accomplish for this season for NFL and DFS.
Well, there are going to be some big guarantees for week one. In terms of, you say there's money behind it. I mean, it's going all in. The site's going all in terms of guarantees week one, and they're not going to stop anytime soon. We want people to be able to come on and win a comparable amount of money, and I think the guarantees are over $500,000. I know they're over 250. So, I mean, there is a huge amount of money to be won in week one. But the thing about our site, and there's a bunch of things that I think we want to establish, is that, your average everyday player has a much better shot on it, because we're going to be limiting entries. That's a big thing that people, scripts are going to be almost useless on fantasy draft because most contests have a 5 to 10 entry limit. So that takes away that advantage. I mean, there's flexibility in the rosters where we have 2 flex spots for football. So you'll be able to start, more of the players you want to play. And, some of the top salaries are more affordable. So again, you can play more of the players you want to play. You'll be playing against some of the pros. I know all of our pros are getting involved. Kevin Love played in the free roll. I know Chris Bosch is going to be playing in the free roll. So you can play against those guys and you can win a lot of money while not having the fear of, the shark dominating in the entries.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the frustrating things that I see is when I look at a big, it's great that sites are putting up money in GPPs, and I get it. Certain sites want to push the envelope and show their entry fees, ballooning. But when I walk in and I see guy after guy after guy with 50, 100, 150 entries, it's kind of like, come on, man. Look, I understand that it's not advantageous maybe for them, to put in all those lineups, and they are taking risk. But in the same token, just, you look at it and say, why do I want to compete against somebody's 50, 100, 150 lineups? I know for me, it's just not something I want to do. I want to play where I'm going against a single, whether it's single entry. I don't mind going against guys 5 to 10, 20 lineups. But when it starts getting 50, 100, 150, it gets a little bit ridiculous, and it's just not attractive for me. And that's why I don't play those contests. If I do, it's very rare. So I think it's great that you've kind of brought that insight. And look, you got to carve a niche in this industry somehow, some way. And if you're in it for the long haul, like fantasy draft is, you can afford to take chances and say, listen, we're going to put money out there, but we don't want people coming in, running scripts, throwing in 200 lineups. We're not worried about just getting this thing filled and having a bunch of big sharks bankroll on our site, because ultimately that's really not very positive long-term growth, because what's going to happen is once the money dries up and you don't run the overlay and you stop letting the massive multi-entry, they're going to move on to something else, and that volume is going to leave the site, and then that leaves you in a negative position. So you might as well get it to the point where, look, you want as many people on the site playing and winning as possible. It doesn't really do anybody any good to have 10 guys winning all the money when you need really 1,000 people winning. So or even more, obviously. So that's something that I definitely found early on at Daily Joust was it was not advantageous for us to have the same people winning over and over and over again. And when you have top heavy prize pools, that's what's going to happen. So you flatten out your prize pools, you limit your multi-entry, and it's better for the ecosystem as a whole. So I'm glad to see that you bring that to the table with fantasy draft. As we wrap up tonight, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you want to throw in and want to add in? I know I'm looking forward to week 1 NFL, obviously, and playing on fantasy drafts. So I'm excited about the tournaments and the contests that are going to be offered.
Yeah, so I should mention, you mentioned the flattened out payouts, that each contest pays out at least 25% of entrants regardless.
Yeah, I have noticed that. Yeah.
I mean, all the big tournaments, so there's going to be some flat payouts. I mean, more people are going to win, and it's always fun to go home a winner, even if it's just a little bit, as opposed to, those nights we've all had on DraftKings and FanDuel when you're right on the edge, but you go home with nothing.
Yeah, that's tough. Or you finish high in the percentage of the prize pool, and then you're doubling your money, and you're like, wait a minute, I finished in the top
Right.
10%, and I doubled my money. What's up with that? So I think that's a little bit frustrating for a lot of people as well. So, all right, Rick. Hey, thanks again for the time tonight. Glad to hear what's going on with fantasy draft. Look forward to meeting up with you week 1 NFL, and that's going to wrap it up for
Yes.
tonight for the state of DFS. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
You got it.